Let's explore some of the synthesis oscillators in the next few videos and modulation in a bit more detail. So here's an analog oscillator, which is a classic virtual analog synthesizer. And this is just a regular sine wave, but we can choose a waveform shape here between this and saw, triangle, sine, and pulse. I'm going to leave it at the standard sine wave for the moment. We have pulse width modulation, which modifies the shape of the waveform. And it's very common, especially in pulse width modulation synthesis, to modulate this. So I'm going to right click and just going to set up at the key group level a basic LFO, which defaults to a sine wave as well. So let's sync it to tempo. We'll set it to half notes for now to start with. Now, the idea with this is that we can offset where it starts in the waveform. So you can hear clearly how it's starting at different places within the wave. Let's leave it at the beginning. We can, of course, modulate the phase if we wanted to, but I'm going to, again, leave it just at the beginning of it. And we'll reduce the ratio a bit. Let's start it a bit lower. All right, that's great. Now, let's look at the mapper editor. We didn't look at this when we explored modulation. But basically, the modulation mapper editor sits between the modulation source, in this case, this LFO, and the parameter that it's modulating, which is that pulse width modulation knob. And it remaps the values of the control signal, meaning this LFO, according to whatever we set here. Now, when there's no mapper chosen, it's a basic one-to-one relationship, and it's not doing anything. But to enable it, we need to choose from whatever exists. There's none in this session yet, so I'm going to add a new one. And we can delete them, rename them, load them, save them, etc. For now, it's just called mapper 0. So we can set the number of steps that we want. Let's double click and enter a value, and I'll put 4 for the moment. And we can set the values that we want. So you hear it going through these different shapes. Based on this. So we can get some interesting different variations like that, and we can set the range if we wanted to go deeper. That's interesting. Now, when we have interpolated on, the mapper transitions smoothly from one value to the next. When it's disabled, it'll transition immediately, and that gives kind of a stair-step kind of effect. Which is interesting. So let's leave it like that. And when we have integer output on, it maps to integer values only. So it changes the rhythm of it in this case. And we can smooth between the steps or snap. So let's close that for the moment. Now we can offset the phase of where this starts, and we can flip the polarity, but neither of these are going to have much influence when it's just this one analog oscillator alone. We have a hard sync mode that determines the phase sync between voices. So when I put this on, voices are going to be phased sync to a silent, invisible control oscillator that we don't see. And it's based on this shift knob, which sets the amount of drift from the control oscillator. And we can modulate this as well. And I'll start by just dragging that same LFO over here. Let's right click and go edit modulation. And we can create another mapper here. There's the one I created already, but let's add a new one. Maybe we'll just make it 3 steps. It gives a nice little bouncing rhythm, so that works for me. So we got the makings of a nice little sound here. We can also use unison spread to thicken this. We can increase the number of voices, and spread them in stereo. We have different modes and degrees of spread here. And detune a little bit. Go random. And let's add on some layer-based effects. Let's try a filter. Maybe we'll go for the new expander filter. All different types to choose from. That'll soften it up a bit. And let's modulate this with maybe one of the new parametric LFOs. We can change the shape. Let's sync it to tempo as well. Start this a bit lower. And we can add in some reverb at the top, and that'll affect everything. Go for a nice medium hall. And here's some sustained chords. A little more interesting rhythmically. So there's a look at the analog oscillator and the new expander filter and the modulation mapper and the new parametric LFO. We'll continue with more in the next video.